Hello everyone, my name is Evgeny Shromer and this is Układ Sił, a YouTube channel of Polish foreign policy magazine. And today I'm very pleased to host Alexander Clarkson, lecturer for German and European Studies at King's College in London. Welcome, sir.
Hi.
And today in the morning, Vladimir Putin and later his spokesman Peskov, they said that they are going to they wish to undertake the talks with the Ukrainian side, which is kind of surprising. Before, they said they actually are going to talk to the Ukrainians only if the Ukrainians are going to elect new government, a new president. So do you find it surprising, and what it means actually, in your opinion?
Not at all. I mean, if you consider that both the Ukrainians and Russians, in an odd way, the Ukrainian and Russian interests, when it comes to dealing with the Trump administration, at least when it comes to tactics for dealing with the Trump administration, actually kind of converge in a way. Neither side is satisfied with the current outcome of the war. Both sides have strong incentives to at least continue fighting into the autumn, because we have another fighting season coming at us. I think the Russian side has an interest in continuing the war because there is, and I think it's an erroneous belief, that they think one next offensive will somehow break the Ukrainians. That's extremely unlikely. In my view, the Ukrainians are not happy with the territorial settlement, and they hope, perhaps more realistically, I don't necessarily think the territorial gains they hope for will result from that, but they hope that if they continue breaking the Russian military machine and smashing it up against their defenses, an opportunity might open up to at least seize land. I think that's more realistic, maybe seize land back. I think there's an opportunity for that around the Dnipro River. I think anything beyond that is wildly ambitious, and I think that's a problem in Kiev in terms of realistic territorial goals and non-realistic, more expansive territorial aims. So both sides are still playing for position. I think both the Europeans and the Americans underestimate the resilience of the Ukrainian population. Having war fatigue is different from wanting to stop the war. I think there are a lot of Ukrainians in Ukrainian society who are tired of the war. There are a lot of Ukrainians in Ukrainian society who have a deep grudge and want to, push the Russians away from their cities or get their land back, because there's a large refugee population in Ukraine. There are a lot in the military that are tired of the war. There are a lot in the military who, have a lot of grudges and scores to settle and want to continue. So I think it's finding a balance. There was an overemphasis in 2022 on those willing to continue to fight, and there was an underemphasis on fatigue. Now there's no overemphasis on fatigue and underestimation willing to fight. Same on the Russian side. Putin is quite clearly unsatisfied with the fact that his maximalist demands cannot be arrived at. His internal legitimacy within the Russian system is contingent on some kind of success that can be sold to Russian elites who have had to take a lot of hits throughout this period. And in a sense, it's more in his interest to continue the war as long as that outcome might seem possible, to push away any day of reckoning he might face internally over the lack of any kind of deeper long-term strategic success, which I don't think the Russians are capable of achieving. He's not yet in a position, I think, where he thinks he has to cash in his chips and just hold on to the territory that he's taken and just accept the fact that, Ukraine has gone off. There's actually a narrative of a partition of Ukraine in parts of the Russian media and intellectual sphere that actually provides the basis for Russia kind of selling, or the regime selling, the idea of, well, we didn't gain all of Ukraine, but we've now had a Yalta-style partition and we get the East and the Russian, those Poles, actually, often it's the Poles who will get the West, or the Europeans get the West. And you can see the kind of 17th century or, the wild fields kind of scenarios and so on. So how does this explain what Putin and Peskov are saying today? The only real people interested in a fast resolution of the war right now are the Americans. Even the Europeans are extremely sketchy about a quick resolution of the war that doesn't settle the Russian issue and lead to permanent quiet on Europe's eastern borders, right? And even the Europeans, and the Europeans are actually in some ways more bellicose and frustrated with Russia than the Americans are at this point, because the risks are right next door. Not just for the East Europeans, by the way, but also, say, for the Italians of the Mediterranean. There are a whole set of problems. I mean, the Italians hope to have a pragmatic arrangements around Libya and the Mediterranean, but they also don't like what the Russians are doing there because they feel it's impinging on their patch. Same with the French in Africa and so on. So it's not just the East, it's also the South. And so until all of these issues are settled and resolved, the Europeans are not particularly happy about a fast resolution either. The only people who are desperate for a quick result are the Americans. And so what do the Russian, Ukrainian, Kiev and Moscow do? They play at negotiations. They try to find reasons for talks about talks without giving anything final away and without stopping the conflict. It's neither Kiev nor Moscow believes that it's in their interest to end the war now. Right? But on the other hand, they both have incentives to keep Trump happy or keep him quiet or keep him on side or get him on side. So you'll keep having these statements, these talks about talks. In Canadian English, although I moved to Europe when I was 11, 12, my English is still Canadian. In Canadian English, the phrase is slow rolling. Right? You kind of keep the guy happy, you slow roll it a bit. You say, okay, we'll talk a little bit more. Oh, there might be a concession, but we have to consult and talk. And you say something extraordinarily self-abasing to Witkoff. You offer him a Trump Tower in Moscow, or you offer a Trump Tower in Kiev. You keep the thing going. And, in a sense, it's not that different from, say, the Iranian strategy towards dealing with the United States. Right? Or in another way, the EU strategy for dealing with the United States in trade, right? That you kind of keep them going and you basically entrench your interests and protect your interests, but you keep them thinking that there's a result just across the corner while you quietly and carefully just, try to make facts on the ground. And so Iran is trying to protect its nuclear program. The Europeans are trying to distract American attention towards other people on trade and trying to minimize the tariffs. And there's a lot to be said about this tactic because the Trump administration is chaotic, strategically incoherent, has multiple clashing factions, and is easily distracted by the next shining ball, right? So, of course, Trump and Peskov say this, and Trump says, Peskov and Putin say this, and Trump's like, oh, that's great. And the Ukrainians will say, we'll really look at your paper, and we'll really take it seriously. But we have to consult a bit more with our European partners next week. And this will just go on and on and on over the summer and the autumn. In the autumn, we'll have to see where things are. I think there is a limit to the bellicosity of both Moscow and Kiev. But I don't see that ending over the summer. I think the Ukrainians are right in terms of the defensive aspect of this, that they can break down the Russian army against their fortifications. Not sure beyond maybe the Dnipro River whether Ukrainian ambitions territorially are realistic, but same from the Russian side. I think the Russians can keep it going for another year or so. But whether just keeping it going is sustainable long term, if it just means throwing more and more troops and equipment against Ukrainian UGVs or UAVs and fortifications. That's something. But we're dealing with an American administration that just has no grasp on these strategic realities, right? So I wouldn't necessarily put too much store in what Peskov, Putin, Zelensky, Umerov, or Sabiha or anyone says about we're paying serious attention to our American partners. I wouldn't take that too seriously.
So as you said, they are trying to keep the guy happy. But the guy seemed to be a little bit upset with the time, but we'll discuss it later. I would like to ask you some questions about Ukraine and Russia, because as you said, it might be very hard for the Ukrainians to get the land back. It might be very hard for the Russians to have more advantages in Ukraine and gain more terrain as well. So if this situation looks like this, it is probably because it is easier to defend yourself than to attack, probably. Yeah. So if the war is becoming a war of attrition for both sides, so maybe it could be an incentive to end it, actually, and maybe in these terms Donald Trump is right somehow.
You shouldn't underestimate the ability of political leaderships to convince themselves that the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow is just around the corner. And however much you can look at the strategic situation and say, well, the defensive has an advantage. And I think the Ukrainians, aren't necessarily wrong in hoping that at some point the Russians just tire out somewhere. And, there's a phrase from boxing called rope-a-dope. It's an old phrase from the Rumble in the Jungle. It's a boxing match between George Foreman and Muhammad Ali, where Muhammad Ali went 9 rounds being punched to pieces by George Foreman, and then took George Foreman out with one punch. And I think that's the kind of Ukrainian imagination of this, which might not be wrong on a minor level, maybe in one or two places that the Russians wear themselves out and the Ukrainians can pick off something that's strategically crucial. I think that, again, I tend to focus on the Dnipro River, even though that's not the main Schwerpunkt of the war, because in terms of Ukraine's political economy, control of the river is really important. If you want a more seamless and easier process of reconstruction, Ukraine needs full control of that river for trade purposes and energy, hydroelectric purposes and irrigation and all the industrial combines going up and down that space. And you need the Russians have to be pushed away a little bit from that. Now, whether Ukraine can get anything else back, I don't know, but I think that should be really a focus, and I think that's not necessarily unrealistic over the long term. But I mean, I think we need to look back at historical precedents, and there's been a lot of terrible historical precedents. People look back to the Second World War or Napoleon or whatever, and I think there's two that are worth considering. There's a kind of a they're pretty bad worst case scenarios, and although they're pretty plausible ones, because I think you'll know from Polish history the concept of the wild fields. The Polish Commonwealth expanding into Ukrainian territory, and there was this large space between the Ottoman empires, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and Muscovy, Russia. In that space in which the Hetmanate emerges, which is the foundation of modern Ukrainian identity. And it's a space that where borders were indeterminate. There was constant movement. There was constant fighting, and you often don't have long periods where you don't have a grand war, but you don't have peace either, right? So it's a constant zone of instability, and that can last for decades, right? I mean, another classic place of geopolitical tension is the borders between, say, the Iranian and the Ottoman empires, or the Roman Empire and Persia, and in along the Tigris and Euphrates, where, and this is my second example, we had a very recent war in the 1980s, the Iran-Iraq War. That lasted for 8 years. And it lasted for 8 years, even though the initial Iraqi offensive failed within about 9 weeks. All right, so the initial Iraqi offensive into Iran was supposed to sort of solve all kinds of domestic problems and strategic problems for Saddam Hussein, seize territory, seize control of the Tigris and Euphrates, and it's 1980. And he runs this, and it already falls apart within about week 7. So you'd think, okay, so there must be some way of doing that. And the Iranians kind of have a few victories, and you think, okay, now it's time to negotiate. We're talking 1982 here, 1981-82. No, the war goes on for another 6 years, because both sides became grasped onto maximalist territorial goals in terms of the Iraqis. They didn't want to let go of these territorial goals, also because of the internal cohesion of the Saddam Hussein regime. And the Iranian government pursued Iraqi regime change because they hoped that the Shia majority would assert itself and all kinds of stuff like that. That went on for 8 years, even though you look at the most documentation, most analysis by about 83, 84. Most external and even internal observers saying this is cooked. There's no way this is going anywhere. Right, but both leaderships kept convincing themselves, or able to mobilize their populations for war for years after that. Now, whether Ukraine is Iran or Iraq or Russia is Iraq or Iran, we can have a wonderful game of comparison, but you shouldn't underestimate the extent to which these things can go on for a very long time. Yeah. I think there was an assessment of average conflict times, internal, external, in the last 30 or 40 years is something above 8 to 9 years. Right, so yeah, I mean, it might seem obvious, but I think Trump is misreading the strategic patience of both sides, and he misreads, because the Americans, even before Trump, I even say under Biden and Obama and Trump 1 and George Bush, Americans traditionally misread the level of will and level of resilience and level of resources non-American societies can mobilize in war. Right, because for Americans, these conflicts are rarely as existential as the societies they're dealing with or facing. And I think that goes for the Americans underestimating European resilience more broadly. I think Europeans are quite resilient, are able to mobilize quite a lot if they have a gun to their head. That's always a big if. Right? So I think Trump is basically misreading the will of both sides to continue. There's a lot of incentives for both, in terms of domestic politics and external relations, for both sides to continue, and they will continue.
But he also has some leverage on both sides. So, for example, he can cut off all the aid that he's providing to Ukrainians, and especially strong hit could be done by cutting off Starlink internet network, which I think Ukrainians, they rely on it to some extent, especially in the terms of drones, which are very important for them as a means of waging the war. On the Russian side, he can also make the oil prices lower, which would destroy Russian economy. This is what many experts say. So I think these tools are very serious and could do a lot of damage to both sides. So this is what many experts also believed when Donald Trump he's going to use this when he said he's going to end the war in 2 days. Then he said he's going to end it till Easter. Of course, we are after Easter, and the war is still going on. So do you think that these tools that Donald Trump has are actually strong, important, and they should be taken into consideration?
No. And I'm very unusual in that. First of all, we look at lowering oil prices. You need to keep in mind that if oil prices go too low, it wipes out the American shale sector. Right? So there's a lot of talk about Trump lowering oil prices and pushing it, say, to $30 or $40, which I think might happen for other reasons to do with his tariff policy and a recessionary dynamic. But if you listen to figures in the U.S. oil sector right now, they are petrified that other issues that we may discuss later to do with tariffs and economic development will lead to a crash in oil prices. And you're going to have a repeat of what we've had several times over in the U.S. oil sector, of a long period of fat profits followed by a sudden crash and a complete reorganization of the sector. This happened several times to the American oil sector, even pre-shale, right? And then this happened in the mid-2010s, it happened in the early 1980s, and so on and so forth, right? And in each of these cases, these lower oil prices also did enormous damage to Russia. So the oil crash of the early 80s, oil price crash of the early to mid 80s, that's one of the things that brings down the USSR. I think it's monocausal to say it's just oil, but it's one of the several factors. But the price the U.S. had to pay was a severely impaired oil and gas sector domestically for about 20 years. So I'm not sure Trump is entirely serious about any of these things. I think we shouldn't overestimate the level of any kind of strategic coherence. So the threat about oil and gas, and the Russians also know that is a gun not a gun that's a boomerang, and you can take out the Russians and it'll take out the U.S. oil and gas sector as well. So I think the Russians don't entirely take. So I don't think, if you look at somebody also with the messianic sense level of delusion that you not always but occasionally find with Putin, I think Putin's willing to take the pain. I think Putin, if you look at the kind of covered by economic analysts like Stodemy Dobrev or Nick Trickett, if you look at the kind of battle going on for the control of Russia's political economy below the surface, there's already an indication that Gazprom is in serious trouble anyway. So the gas sector is not throwing out the cash anyway. There's a lot of battle for control of the remnants of the oil sector. The oil sector is also in severe trouble because of all kinds of investment in capex issues. I think in the end, Putin is willing to take the pain. He's willing to deal with oil prices because he has a messianic vision of him restoring Russian global power. The fact that he's actually generating a dynamic that is more likely to fragment Russia over time is another story, right? But that's the difference between the short term and long term. And Putin is a mortal man, and I don't think he's thinking long term in any kind of strategic coherent sense. Same for the Ukrainians. I think Starlink has always held up as this big threat. The Ukrainians have been working for a back end around Starlink for the use of their drones for over 18 months now. I mean, Ukraine has probably one of the most advanced global drone industries in the world. And I mean, the Ukrainians have had a lot of tough lessons, particularly when several attacks on Crimea were sabotaged by meddling with Starlink by Trump, by Musk and others. Really at the really early stage of the war. So again, yeah, losing Starlink will cause the Ukrainians trouble. But again, it's like this. It's like one of these. I'll give you another example. It's not related to this conflict. Like there's always this claim that if the Americans cut off their aid to Israel, the Israelis will stop. Like, no, this is a government that has made plans. It has a nuclear deterrent. It has a whole bunch of other things. It will cause them enormous harm. It might slow them down eventually. But the Israeli government has a certain dynamic. It has a far right. It has a certain, there was an existential dynamic after October the 7th. So just to sit back and just say, America can just flick a switch and stop these things is, in my view, really, really a view that is profoundly problematic in terms of understanding the global system. Reduces everything to a kind of American strategic unipolarity that probably ceased to exist 10 to 15 years ago. Underestimates the will and resources of various smaller actors, and severely it underestimates, when it comes to oil prices, the problems this raises for the Americans. It underestimates the Russian elite's will to just keep going for the moment, partly under the pressure of Putin's personal circle, and it underestimates the skill and will of the Ukrainians, however much this would cause them a lot of trouble, both sides, whatever leverage they do. And I think this is the problem with the Americans. They came in, and this isn't just a Trump problem. This is a deeply embedded problem within the American foreign policy elite, that they consistently overestimate the amount of leverage they have. they consistently overestimate. I remember this going back to the Eurozone crisis. They kept showing up in Europe and saying, be at these symposia and panel events and discussions like, why won't the Europeans follow our economic advice about how to Eurozone crisis? And you just say, but because you have no leverage and they don't care and they have a different view of the problem and they're just going to ignore you and you just have to live with that. And there's an inability on the U.S. to side really long before Trump to understand and properly gauge U.S. leverage, which is still considerable, which is still massive, but has to be deployed with an understanding of local conditions on the ground to be effective. And if you're going to take anyone who's going to be very bad at this, it's going to be Donald Trump.
So some experts, they actually believe that the US, Donald Trump, they actually know that the unipolar moment has ended, and now it's time to choose some partners in the world to maintain the current situation. So they believe actually that the US is going to do something called reverse Kissinger or reverse Nixon to align somehow with Russia to counter China, and Ukraine or Eastern Europe or Europe in general can be sacrificed to achieve this goal. So do you think that this is something that is probable, that is possible? And do you think that the current American administration is actually doing it?
So I think there's a lot going on with that, and I'll take it in two parts. The part of what I think is taking place in the Trump administration and the problems with the reverse Kissinger narrative in itself. I think part of what we're seeing is Trump is not a strategic thinker. And actually, not just Trump, but many of the figures around him are largely figures who are immersed in American culture wars, in American domestic ideological polarization, in an environment in which foreign policy is largely viewed in domestic political terms. So Ukraine is coded within these discourses as liberal and European. The Europeans are coded as liberal, right? And decadent and Democrat, right? This is, even though Ukraine and EU governments have a whole range of different political spectrums, and there may be a foreign policy consensus among much of the European, from left to right among much of the European spectrum, but that doesn't mean that these different groups in European politics don't disagree on all kinds of other things. But this isn't about the realities here. It's about how Europe is viewed in American discourse. It's actually deeply anchored. If you go back to the 1770s, the American Revolution, the idea of the Europeans as being decadent and corrupt and old world to be overcome, an old world to be abandoned. You know, this is the foundation of U.S. isolationism, the Monroe Doctrine, in the 19th and early 20th century. This is deeply embedded concepts in American political discourse. You might even argue, and I would argue, that transatlanticism, a U.S. commitment to global security and European security, is the exception rather than the rule in the overall history of U.S. relations with the wider world. So if you then think that we're not dealing with people who really view foreign policy as an end in itself, they view it as a means to an end, as just another weapon in the domestic political culture war, then what you have is Trump's impulses and the impulses of many others around him reflected in this. The idea, well, why don't we just give Europe to the Russians? Curtis Yarvin, who's a kind of a tech fascist writer who's very prominent in American billionaire Silicon Valley circles, basically says it out now and says he also thinks America should become a monarchy, right? So he's a very popular thinker among much of the U.S. right, and he sort of says, well, why don't we just leave Europe to the Russians or some other more vigorous civilization? So the Europeans, again, this is not the reality of Europe. I think Europe is a really resilient and tough place made up of a lot of tough and resilient people who, the problem in Europe is Europeans can get their shit together, but they need to be like in an existential moment to do that. And we need to think about how we can preempt crises rather than having to then make these choices, which are often the right choices, in the middle of a crisis. So that's a slightly different discussion. But so what you then have with the reverse Kissinger thing is you have an attempt to create a strategic logic out of things in U.S. domestic politics that are a product of impulses that are entirely culturally coded. So you have people like Eldridge Colby and others who are a little bit immersed in foreign policy traditions, trying to say, okay, this is what the boss wants. Let's try to turn this into a coherent strategy. So the reverse Kissinger thing only arose after Trump had basically signaled that he wanted to go soft on Russia. After many people on the American right were saying, well, we just give these decadent and lazy and Europeans who are drag on our budgets and so on.
So sorry for stopping you, but you mentioned Eldridge Colby. I think he wrote it in his book, Strategy of Denial. It was published in 2020, and he said that aligning with Russia would be very beneficial for the US, although
Yeah.
this is not possible probably, but it would be very good for the US, right?
But Elbridge Colby is best understood as somebody who has a good nose for where the U.S. right is going and tries to position himself ahead of it. Like look, I don't work in the U.S. field. I can say this with my opinions about several of these figures involved in this very openly, right? I think he's always managed to sort of somehow land himself just where you can maybe find, a way of attaining a degree of influence. And I don't really think in his or the case of some of these other figures I have in the back of my mind that this is necessarily about any real coherent, deep strategic goal. It's about, this is a means to positioning within the U.S. domestic power political play. Right? I think many of these guys would, just as Vance did in his opinions over Trump, would suddenly pivot to something else if that was what was needed in order to remain in the log rolling exercise that is currently surviving MAGA Republican politics in Washington. So that's my view. And so in that kind of larger context, right, the reverse Kissinger thing is just like it's an attempt to sort of provide an intellectual facade of rationality to what is a fundamentally ideological impulse, a shift to authoritarianism, a kind of cultural admiration for illiberal figures like Bukele, like Putin, even in a strange way for Xi. I mean, you'll find this in certain strands of thought, right? So I think that's where the reverse Kissinger thing was. It was an attempt after the fact to rationalize a set of impulses towards authoritarian regimes that reflected a really domestic ideological dynamic. What's the problem with the reverse Kissinger concept in itself? The problem with the concept is it's completely ahistorical. It gets the history completely wrong. Kissinger only has an opening to pull China towards the United States after China and the USSR had entered into a split and almost fought a war over the Siberian-Manchurian border in 68-69. The American pivot to China's pivot to America and the US pivot to China in 1970 to 73 happens 10 years after the Sino-Soviet split, right? The Americans didn't pull China. China had already broken with the USSR. And it wasn't just that this was like a unique American process. The French, the West Germans, the Canadians, the British, all of the US's European allies, the Japanese and their allies in Asia, had by the early 70s developed strategies that were similar to Nixon's trip to China. What Kissinger was doing, it was surprising in terms of the timing, and that was done still with the Vietnam War taking place. And it was surprising the way it was pulled off, and the fact that Nixon himself went. That was hugely surprising. That was quite audacious. But the actual move itself was completely uncontroversial. It was more controversial in U.S. domestic politics than it was in European, West European, or Asian foreign policy circles. I mean, there was some on the Japanese side who were extremely doubtful and skeptical and worried and so on and so forth. But broadly, the only people who really got shafted were the Taiwanese. So in that sense, what this reverse Kissinger thing is it's a total misreading of the history. Right? What they're trying to do is cause a split between China and Russia, even though Russia is moving closer to China. Right? Why should the Chinese bother, particularly if they're getting tariffed to shit by the Trump administration? Right? What are the incentives here for the Russians to move if the Chinese can make the Russians a better offer? You know, so I think that's a completely ahistorical move.
To answer this question, I may say that many Western media and also Sergei Lavrov, he recently said that the Americans could somehow help the Russians to sell natural gas and oil to Europe again, and the Americans could buy infrastructure like Nord Stream pipelines, but also Shved refinery. So maybe that could be an incentive for the Russians to earn money again. But on the other hand, they themselves actually stopped the deliveries, right? When they attacked Ukraine.
They themselves stopped the deliveries, and this whole notion of and it's very, very interesting that it's driven by two elites, an American MAGA Republican elite and a Russian elite, that are harking back to something in the past. They're harking back to past glories. And so there's this hope for a new Yalta, right? The idea that Washington and Moscow can sit together and once again fix the problems of the world. And it plays up to Trump. Remember, Trump and Putin themselves were socialized ideologically and politically in the 1970s and 1980s. They're anchored in that past. So, of course, when Lavrov says all of this, it appeals not just to and there were elements of this thinking in the Biden administration, the Obama administration, and so on. The problem is the world, it's not 1988 anymore. And the European Union is a highly active and effective global trade actor. There are various European governments that through the European Union have various channels to block things and stop things. There are various economic interests in terms of the renewable energy sector, in terms of the Italians with their desire to have a really tight control over European energy through Eni, Norwegian interests in terms of the gas trade, the contracts with Sonatrach, Alpha. I mean, there's a lot of different interests in European energy sector that are not necessarily fans of bringing the Russians back in, because they now are making the money off of lack of a Russian natural resources presence. Like, it would be just a bad business for the Norwegians for the Russians to come back. Same for the Dutch, right? And so like it's and all of these different actors can channel their concerns through the European Union. That has weaknesses in some areas, but is massively underestimated strengths in others. So in this kind of, and I think that's something Poles are often slightly to the side of, because you're not part of the Eurozone. You are, I mean, in a sense, there are multiple levels of integration in the European system. The Poles are not actually fully integrated in the European system because they're not part of the Eurozone and they're not part of the ECB. And I think that's the final step. If you're not part of the Eurozone, you're ECB, you do not have full control of every level of European integration, right? So you might like the zloty, and that's great, but that means that you do not have the full level of leverage you gain of being in all parts of the European Union. So ultimately, this vision is just complete. I mean, it also doesn't really acknowledge or grapple with China or Japan or Indonesia or India. I mean, India is trying to lock down strategic control of the Indian Ocean world, right? Or even Brazil in the Western Hemisphere. So there's this vision of America withdrawing into the Western Hemisphere and locking it down control, which the Brazilians are not going to stand for. They once had a nuclear program in the 1970s, and had to be talked out of that by the mid-1980s. Right, so the Brazilians are not going to play that game either. So I think it's a kind of a vision of a kind of a meeting between Trump and Putin, and the problems of the world are solved, and then we get all set into a different spheres of influence. And it's dangerous because the more these powers pursue an outmoded understanding of the geopolitical map, the more they actually exacerbate, worsen, and lengthen conflicts. And by pursuing strategies that are completely detached from both the geopolitical and geoeconomic order.
So let's discuss the tariffs Donald Trump imposed and is going to probably impose more on the European Union, especially. Well, if we assume that his decisions are not really decisions, but they are impulses, as you said, so we may figure that out by examining the formula he actually used for making those tariffs. It was very simple mathematical calculation. So. But some people, they tend to see some deeper strategy actually in this decision by Donald Trump, because he imposed 10% tariffs on the whole bloc, whole union. But not all the countries, they have surplus in trading with the US. The Germans, they have, the French also, but way smaller. But countries like the Netherlands or Poland even, or Spain, they do not. They have deficits. So those experts, they say this is a tool of dividing the European Union to make some bilateral deals with separate countries, and this could break down the whole bloc. So, what's your opinion on that?
I think that is again imputing too much strategic genius into a team of people who are just strategically incoherent and don't understand what they're dealing with, either when it comes to the European Union or China. Or India, for that matter. And those, if we speak of a geopolitical big four, those are the big four, right? Russia's a regional power and is struggling to even maintain that. But if you're talking about in terms of states that can combine a degree of military power, nuclear deterrence, and geoeconomic order, and the EU is kind of half a state and not a state, so you can have a big discussion about where exactly lands in that spectrum. But there are only 4 global players at that level, if you're really talking about spheres of influence and such like. And the way to cause these tensions in the EU, which I don't think would work because too many of the European states are too economically intertwined with one another and interdependent. So if we think of this in supply chain terms, yes, The Netherlands say some states have a deficit in trade with the United States, and some states have an export surplus. But that doesn't really work if you look at the integrated nature of European supply chains. Right, so there are a lot of Polish firms that supply parts to German companies, and those parts become German products that become exported to the United States, for example. If you take out a large part of the German industrial sector, there are many, many Polish firms that are going to suffer. And it's not just, I think there's a consensus in Polish politics that understands this. This isn't just a Tusk or a PO issue. It's PIS understood this as well, just as well. Right? I mean, they push things very hard, PIS, but they also always manage to maintain a very pragmatic, it's interesting that PS always found fascinating is it was not Orban or Fidesz. It always found a kind of a pragmatism. There was a lot of talk, but there was actually a lot of pragmatism as well, which I think explains a lot of the differences between Warsaw and Brussels relations and Budapest-Brussels relations in the past decade. But so ultimately what you then have is a situation where Europe is a genuinely single market. The European single market is more integrated than the Canadian single market. Or many nations, there are many states who have less the United States in many areas has less market integration between U.S. states than the EU has between so-called nation states, right? And if you consider the way these supply chains work, yes, if you put it up in a nation-state basis, you'd say, okay, so Portugal has a surplus, whatever. There are many Portuguese firms that also do services and supply and logistics for, say, German firms or French firms or Italian firms. Right? You cannot. One of the reasons why the EU is so resilient is that even while everybody is arguing on the surface, under the surface, each of these societies is becoming fundamentally interdependent, intertwined. Like it's basically state formation 101. That the basic below the surface things happen first, before the surface level identity and broader ideological shifts create the basis for a more cohesive nation state. Right? I mean, if it was anything other than Europe, people would already be calling this a state formation project. It's just because we have a nation state tradition and all these tensions that people are still reluctant to go that far. And so, what would be a way of putting real tension to this? The way the Americans could have really caused a lot more tension, trouble than it did, because notice how little trouble it's actually caused the EU, is if the Trump government administration had said, we're not doing a universal tariff for EU exports. We will do a different tariff for each EU member state. Right? Now I still think Brussels would have managed it because of the supply chain, also financial services. Right, there's not capital markets integration is a real problem, and there's not real CMU, and fine. But actually, if you look at the European banking and finance sector, again, Polish banks and Italian banks, they're all like if you unwrench that, you have a financial crisis in each of them. That's again another reason why the euro survived. And so, I think even they'd survive that. But if you really, really wanted to mess with the EU, you would say, no, we're not doing universal. We don't recognize the EU even as a thing. We're not doing a universal tariff for the EU. We're going to tariff each individual state differently and ignore Brussels entirely and bypass it. They didn't do that because it's not a coherent strategy. Right? It's not. It's an impulse. It's tariff good. And also there is an element, and this is you have to really, really look very closely and parse Ron Navarro's. Was this Peter Navarro's advice to and what he's saying openly is he's not pursuing tariffs to get trade agreements. He wants an autarkic United States, right? There's different factions. So Bessent and Lutnick, they want trade agreements with the United States, although on a completely unrealistic basis, because these are hedge fund guys who have no idea how supply chains work, right? But fine. But at least these people you can negotiate with. But if you look at like Navarro and many others, like Stephen Miller, people around Trump, they're not interested in trade deals. They want autarky. Right? They want to pull production into the Western Hemisphere, lock down imperial control of the entire Western. The Brazilians will not be on board with that. Never mind the Canadians and Mexicans. But the vision is, autarkic control of the Western Hemisphere and a repatriation, a reshoring of production in the United States, all production. And if you take it to its extreme, and you can hear that some of what Trump says to other Republican figures, it's like, we don't need taxes. We'll just cut all our taxes and have government revenue through tariffs. Which is completely contradictory, of course, because if you're reshoring production, but you're then making government revenue based on tariffs, you reduce your tariff intake. If you eliminate imports, none of this is coherent or rational. It's an impulse. It's an ideological impulse that is driven by profound traditions in U.S. foreign policy and ideology. going back to the 1770s, based on mercantilism, autarchism, a vision of the rest of the world has failed, and America is this lone beacon of hope, which on the other hand must be sort of racially pure because there's an element of racism. All of that, you cannot separate these domestic political dynamics from the foreign and the trade policy. Because if you try to treat the foreign and the trade policy separate from the ideological domestic dynamics taking place in the U.S., none of this makes sense. It only makes sense if you place the domestic in relation to the external, which is the basic foundations of international relations and political science, which a lot of people seem to forget when trying to analyze this and projecting some sort of strategy which just isn't there.
So we've been discussing and picturing the current geopolitical landscape, which is not very colorful, especially for countries like Poland. And I promised to Professor Tomasz Drabowicz, who introduced us to each other on Twitter, to ask you what Poland should do, to specifically ask you this question in those current times. So we see problems with America, with American politicians and strategy. We see that, as you described, the Ukrainian-Russian war is not going to end soon, or maybe it's going to stabilize, but it's going to be still ongoing. And we have European countries which are in trouble. You specialize also in the field of German politics. We see that Germany is strongly hit by the tariffs imposed by the Trump administration on cars, but also the German struggle in the Chinese market, where they also used to benefit a lot. So, what Poland should do?
I think, well, first of all, Poland has to be realistic about the extent to which its economy is interdependent with the rest of the European economy. Like, which Poland shows for a lot of very good reasons, and reasons that Poland has massively profited from economically and socially and politically. It shows European integration. But European integration has trade-offs. Everything has trade-offs. First of all, there's the sovereignty issue. There's the pooling of sovereignty, right? And the paradox that the more you integrate into the EU, the more control you have over these levers of the EU. So I'm not suggesting you join the euro anytime soon. I'm simply saying, like, the paradox of European integration is the less integrated you are in the EU, actually less power you have over these institutions that are determining what you're doing. So if you're not integrating fully into the currency system either, there's a whole set of things that you don't control, which will also affect the value of the zloty and all sorts of bunch of things. So I think there needs to be a debate about how much further the Polish society wants to do this. And the reason I'm saying this is that there is both an ideological and like an emotional, or say even form of European patriotism, in the sense that, this is we are all pretty different, but actually more similar than we are different to one another, and we have to work together. We either hang together or hang separately. So they're both kind of ideological and emotional things. But I think the problem is that we have these kind of very airy cultural studies-ish debates about European identity that miss the more fundamental political, economic, and strategic reasons why these different states opt for union, for the European Union. And I think this is something the Polish political elite does need to sort of consider, because it involves a whole set of trade-offs, right? Your prosperity is based on integration in German, Italian, and French markets, which has helped make Poland one of the, if we were talking about big four or big five, it is historically unprecedented how much Poland is now on the top table. It's really, I don't know, since the 18th century, maybe 17th century, Poland has not been on the top table in Europe. It's the first time it is really on the top table in Europe, really in 200 years, which is a remarkable domestic achievement. It's a domestic achievement of Polish political elites. And I'm of the left, but I think there are a lot of PIS people who also, at least in the initial first years of that government, did a lot of good work for this too, right? This is a genuinely bipartisan achievement in Polish society.
Yeah, I think that people are afraid actually in Poland, experts, that if we integrate stronger with the European Union, the stronger integration means usually making more decisions using the QMV, so it's qualified majority voting.
I think that's coming. I think that's coming.
So this is something that gives more advantage to stronger or more populist countries like France or Germany, but it has to be said that Poland also is a populist country within the EU.
This is my thing. This is. I would understand those arguments more from a Czech or a Slovak perspective. Or an Estonian or even a Finnish perspective. I really think, and this is where I'm coming into a more bullish perspective in terms of Poland's role. I think the Poles can approach this process. This doesn't mean they have to adopt the euro. I'm just simply saying there's trade-offs, right? There's also understandable reasons why you don't want to adopt the euro, right? So this is all because there are some big trade-offs with that, and that's understandable. But I think the Poles can actually approach this with much greater self-confidence, right? And the reason I'm going on about, like, you have to sort of really consider what can you do to build up leverage within the European system. So the massive expansion of defense industries is one very positive example. Like, there's a clear understanding that presenting Poland as the sword and shield, sort of use an old phrase, of Europe, maybe in partially. I know there's a law. I mean, I'm half Ukrainian, so I very well understand the traditional Polish-Ukrainian tensions. But I mean, in parts of Ukrainians and Romanians and Finns, like, you can present this model just as the Italians and French present themselves to the rest of Europe as the protectors of the South. In military and strategic terms, like, there's a lot, but it can't just be military. There are huge strengths in the Polish services sector. There are huge strengths in Polish industry and supply chains. Some of the most modern industrial plant in Europe. You have some firms and corporations that are really aggressively moving in on European markets and doing really, really well. And I think that's something where Poles, there is a kind of a defensiveness, I think, that's set in because of the rule of law disputes about 5, 6, 7 years ago. There's a defensive, even on the opposition side of the time, which is now in government, there's a defensiveness. We Poles, what can we do? And it's like, there is, I think, the extent to which, and I find this also with Romanian interlocutors or Finnish interlocutors, there is a sense of, like, there's still this memory of being a poorer, smaller place. And there's not an awareness of your own power within the EU system just because it's becoming more like a state. Doesn't mean that the different member states don't matter hugely to how it works. Doesn't mean that you as a member state can build up a position of strength within Brussels. Right. And the reason I'm saying this is it's about thinking strategically. How can Poland build up a position of strength in Brussels so that you are on that top table and you call the shots?
In terms of defense industry, the major fear is that we are on the front line right now, and we are getting most of the weapons from the US, right? Because they have production capabilities and they can deliver them very quickly. So. But some other states within the EU, like Spain or Germany and France, they don't consider Russia as such a threat as Poland does, right? So they may use the QMV, for example, to push us to buy European industry products in terms of the defense instead of buying Americans because they want us to help their industries, right? But this
is where I'm going with this.
Mm-hmm.
Where I'm going with this is saying, Poles and every other European state have to prepare for a post-American order. We need to stop assuming that the Americans will be there around or are even interested in helping us. I mean, that's my key message here. And what I'm saying is, if you start saying, okay, if you start viewing American protection not as an existential thing that will always be there, but just as an added bonus, an added extra, you start rethinking your entire Europe and also your entire global strategy. Right, you as Poles start thinking, and I'd say the same to the Italians. The Italians actually, there's an interesting, the way the Italian defense budget is also calculated is really fascinating. Like the top line numbers don't quite match how much they're really spending because of all kinds of complicated things to do with the Eurozone crisis and what they had. They wanted to hide their naval expenditure, and it was a different story there. The GDP numbers for Italy don't quite fit up what they actually spend, which is a lot on the Navy, but not on the Army. And so for the Italians, the similar law. I have had this discussion with people on the Italian side, and you say, look. And the Italians, for other reasons, are like, do we want to entirely? And actually, they often sound like the Poles. Like, do we want to entirely trust the French? It's not dissimilar, right? And because the Italians and French have clashes of interest, which Brussels always struggles to manage over exactly how to manage EU Mediterranean policy, right? This is something the Poles aren't necessarily entirely involved in. But in the end, my advice is the same. Like, yes, fine. If you want to. Still have a degree of control, you're going to have to invest more in your own capacity and capability, and then come to Brussels and other European partners and say, look, we have all this stuff. You cannot rely on the Americans anymore. That's my message. Not relying on the Americans anymore doesn't mean that you just sort of roll over and say, oh, France, Germany, we have to do what you want. It means seizing control of the moment, taking the strategic assets that you have, which are substantial. I'd say the same in terms of Poland, in terms of land power, in terms of Italy, in terms of naval power. I always think the Italians and Poles should work together more because they for different reasons have these lingering desire not to be trodden on by the Germans and French for quite different reasons, but the sentiment is often really interestingly similar. And I always thought Rome and Warsaw, I'm always surprised that Rome and Warsaw don't work together more in Brussels, because that would be there's actually a lot of convergence of interest here. And so in that kind of context, What I'm arguing is that if you go back to what I was saying about these long ideological trends in U.S. society, this transatlantic moment over the 70, 80 years, where you had a different consensus that doesn't actually match the long arc of U.S. history and the strength of isolationist sentiment, and the extent to which even Poland, and a lot of American discourse on the right, and also parts of the left, use Europe as a burden and a waste of money and a waste of resources and as lazy and as decadent. And why are we even helping these people? If you're aware of that, you don't take American help for granted. Of course, you seize every kernel you can, because that makes a lot of sense, not just for Poland, but for Europe. But on the other hand, if you cease being complacent about that American help, you start rethinking, saying, okay, we can't trust the Americans anymore, but we also don't want the Germans or French or anyone to tell us what we do. We do accept that we're part of this European Union thing, and Brussels plays a big role, and we're integrated, but we want to have a say, and we want to be at that top table. Then that becomes a strategic discussion about how does Poland, and I really think it's really fascinating how much in a land power way, Poland's kind of frustration but also advantages parallel Italians' advantages in sea power. So this is an interesting there's an edited collection in there somewhere. And so in that sense, it's about sitting down and saying, how can we maximize our leverage and power in Brussels to make sure that whatever Paris and Berlin cook up, they can't do it past us. And I think whereas Czechia and Sweden or whatever, all those other countries, it's much tougher for them in that sense, right? Because they have to find a niche. They have to find something really specific. Poland and Italy are big enough and strong enough and mean enough to be able to do that, right? And I've always puzzled me that, and I think this kind of Polish, I understand historically because it goes back to the 1990s and the experience of the Cold War, why there's this still desire for Washington to come in and help you out. But you don't need Washington. Like Poland doesn't need America like this. Right, I really think, and I understand historically where that lack of self-confidence, strategic self-confidence, often comes from, which is odd because there's a very bumptious and cultural Polish national narrative that's very expansive. But strategically, there's often it punches under its weight, weirdly enough. And I think there's an extent to which it's also because there's this looking back towards Washington. What do you do if Washington isn't there anymore? Right, you need to start thinking in those terms.
Yeah, I would definitely agree that strong and capable defense sector in Europe is in our interest, because at the end of the day, France and Germany, they have skin in the game, way more than Washington does, right, in Europe. Yeah. So thank you very much for this very interesting and insightful, comprehensive interview. I was interviewing Alexander Clarkson from King's College in London. Thank you very much, sir.
Thanks very much.
And many thanks to our viewers. Goodbye.